Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into what is arguably the absolute most controversial part of Robert Greene's famous book, The 33 Strategies of War. Honestly, if you've ever found yourself totally outgunned, outmaneuvered, or just feeling completely outmatched in life or business, well, you are in the right place. Let's get into it. So, we are zeroing in exclusively on Part 5 of Greene's book, which he notoriously dubs Unconventional or Dirty War. The core philosophy here? It's pretty simple but incredibly profound. When you're the underdog, going toe-to-toe in direct confrontation, that's just foolish. Meeting force with force is a quick way to get crushed. Victory, instead, requires deception, a whole lot of psychology, and a ruthless willingness to literally rewrite the rules of engagement. Okay, let's map out exactly how we're going to tackle this. We'll start with the art of dirty war, then look at how to master deception and misdirection, move on to weaponizing morality and psychology, dig into sabotage, attrition, and infiltration, unpack the chain reaction strategy, and finally wrap up with winning your own wars.
Right, let's kick things off with Section 1, The Art of Dirty War.
Picture this. You're David, and you're staring down a literal Goliath. You don't have the size, you definitely don't have the budget, and you're severely lacking in firepower. So, what's the play? You lean into unconventional war. This is all about pulling off a win through deception and psychological manipulation instead of just brute head-on force. Think of it kind of like a strategic game of judo, right? You aren't trying to match your opponent's massive weight. You are taking their weight, their momentum, and even their expectations, and using all of that to throw them completely off balance.
Moving right along to Section 2, Master Deception and Misdirection.
Let's look at the first real weapon in this underdog arsenal. Manipulating reality itself. Greene calls this Strategy 23, weaving a totally seamless blend of fact and fiction. Look back at World War II, just before the Normandy invasion. The Allies completely scrambled Adolf Hitler's decision-making. And how did they pull that off? They didn't just hide, they actively fed him massive lies. They actually sent a body double of General Montgomery to a totally different theater of war. And they built this gigantic phantom army over in England, literally complete with inflatable fake tanks. They made their strong points look incredibly weak, and their weakest points look like absolute fortresses. Which sets us up perfectly for Strategy 24, taking the line of least expectation. Way back in 219 BC, Hannibal successfully baited the highly structured Roman army across the Trebia River. See, the Romans had a very specific, rigid mental model of exactly how war was supposed to be fought. So Hannibal, he just completely shattered that image. When the Romans crossed that river, they didn't just meet a standard army, they found themselves staring down literal, gigantic war elephants. The takeaway here is that massive advantage comes from completely breaking your opponent's expectations.
And sometimes, that misdirection is a bit more diplomatic. Strategy 27 focuses on seeming to work for the interests of others while actually quietly furthering your own. A great example. Back in 1467, the Duke of Burgundy allied with England, fully intending to attack Louis of France. But Louis caught wind of this, so what does he do? In the exact same breath, he allies himself with England too, completely neutralizing the Duke's grand plan. The crucial thing to remember here is this. Absolutely make alliances that benefit you, but always, always keep in mind that rarely does anyone offer help without their own hidden agenda.
All right, let's shift gears to Section 3, Weaponize Morality and Psychology.
So if deception breaks your opponent's eyes, weaponizing morality and psychology will totally break their mind. Strategy 25 tells us we have to occupy the moral high ground. By framing any conflict as a clear us versus them scenario, you effectively demonize the enemy. Martin Luther did this brilliantly against Pope Leo X. When the Pope tried selling privileges to essentially forgive sins, Luther didn't raise an army. He attacked with the Bible. He exposed the blatant hypocrisy, painting his own side as deeply virtuous and his opponent as, well, downright evil.
And when your enemy actually starts to crack under that kind of psychological pressure, that is when you deploy Strategy 28. Don't interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. Back in 1635, this super arrogant Bishop of Noyons was a huge threat to the French Academy. But rather than fighting him tooth and nail, they simply gave him a platform. They literally just let him deliver a speech where all his blind spots and sheer arrogance were on full, painful display. He humiliated himself so thoroughly that he packed up and left completely on his own. Give your rivals enough rope and they will absolutely hang themselves.
But how exactly do you plant those seeds? Strategy 30 lays it out. Penetrate their minds. Because words are weapons. When Niccolò Machiavelli was stripped of his post in Florence, he didn't go out and raise a militia. He sat down and wrote a profoundly articulate letter about how to maintain power. That letter, as you might have guessed, eventually became the famous book The Prince, which completely immortalized him. The point is, precise, highly valuable ideas can penetrate way deeper than any sword ever could.
That brings us to Section 4, sabotage, attrition, and infiltration.
So what happens when you're up against a massive, seemingly unstoppable physical force? You have to focus on grinding that opponent down from both the outside and the inside. Strategy 26 is brutal. Deny them targets. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia with a staggering 450,000 men. He retreated with barely 100,000. And the Russians didn't even fight him in some massive cinematic clash. They just played for time. They drew the French deeper and deeper, intentionally destroying their own resources so the French couldn't scavenge a thing, and basically let the freezing cold and starvation do all the heavy lifting. When your rival is itching for a fight, totally frustrate them with your absence.
Now, if you can't starve them out, you pivot to Strategy 31, destroy from within. Think classic Trojan horse here. A fascinating modern example from the source material is Wilhelm Canaris. He infiltrated the German Defense Ministry in 1933. Hitler himself completely trusted this guy. It literally took the SS a full 10 years to realize Canaris was actively working against them the whole time. You don't try to bash your head against an unbreakable wall, you just find a way to get invited inside.
Moving to Section 5, the chain reaction strategy. Have you ever wondered how tiny, heavily calculated actions can just snowball into massive, unstoppable shifts in power? Well, Strategy 29 is all about taking small bites. Take Charles de Gaulle's famous salami tactic during World War II. He started by asking Winston Churchill for just one single, small radio broadcast to France. Churchill says yes. Then, on air, de Gaulle promises his listeners he'll be back the next day, which, by the way, was definitely not approved. But Churchill just played along to avoid the headache of a confrontation. Slice by slice, de Gaulle gathered support, built an army, and ultimately created the French resistance. People naturally have short attention spans and hate conflict, so they often just give in to these tiny demands that, before you know it, add up to total control.
Which brings us to a really massive, fascinating question. How on earth do you defeat an entire empire without throwing a single punch?
The answer lies in Strategy 32, dominate while seeming to submit. Mahatma Gandhi arranged a 200-mile march just to protest the salt tax. The authorities looked at it, thought it was totally harmless, and just let it happen. But that act of peaceful non-aggression ended up mobilizing thousands, and it completely flipped the power dynamic upside down. By the time the government finally woke up to what was really going on, it was way too late to stop this brilliant passive-aggressive maneuver.
And harnessing that kind of momentum leads to Strategy 33, the chain reaction. Now, history definitely shows us the darker side of this. The Nizari assassins historically spread chaos by hiding in plain sight, striking just to spark paranoia and massive uncertainty. But, and this is a huge pivot in Green's text, chain reactions do not have to be evil. You can absolutely be the catalyst for a positive chain reaction, spreading sentiments where good ultimately triumphs.
And finally, Section 6, winning your own wars.
Look, all these historical tactics we've talked about, the deep deception, the psychological warfare, the strategic judo moves, they aren't just dry history lessons. Green's text actually caps this all off with this incredibly profound cascading quote from an unknown monk back in 1100 AD. The monk talks about how he desperately wanted to change the world, then scaled it down to changing his nation, then his town, and then just his family. But in his old age, he had this massive realization. The only thing he could ever truly change was himself, and if he had just started there, that inner, personal change would have rippled outward to his family, his town, his nation, and maybe ultimately the world. True unconventional warfare, the real source of power, literally starts with conquering yourself. If you want to change the battlefield out there, you've got to start by winning the war in here. Definitely something to chew on the next time you're facing down an impossible obstacle. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.